Welcome to the Polymer Science Podcast. I am Dr. Alicia
And I'm Jacob Scheckman.
In this podcast, we'll be speaking to researchers from around the world and talk to them about how their work is improving our daily lives. I hope you enjoy our conversation and that you learn something new.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Polymer Science Podcast. My name is Jacob Scheckman, and today my guest is Dr. Barney Grubbs. Dr. Barney Grubbs, thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you?
Thanks, Jacob. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. And one thing I want to bring up first is I've been using Calendly. It's been really easy for booking these interviews. And the question I had at the end, which is just an optional thing, and it helps me sort of get the show going, is what do you feel happy about today? And several people have I have lots of interviews coming up, so it's very exciting. But you have given the most detailed answer, and I really appreciate that. If I can go read this real quick, what you were happy about your family. Your kids started 10th grade on September, 9 days ago. 9 days ago. That's amazing. What was that experience like?
It's kind of fun but also frightening to relive secondhand I guess both the joys and the horrors of starting high school. And sort of figuring everything out, because our district, it's 10th grade is the first year you're at the high school. So.
Oh, okay. I see.
We do 10 through 12. So it's it's a little dramatic, but it's good.
It's exciting.
The most traumatic part is the bus comes at like 6:30 in the morning.
Oh my gosh. Oh God.
So
hopefully that's prepping them for later on in life when you got to take advantage of those mornings. And some of the other things you mentioned, well, let me read this here. There are still a few months before it gets really cold, and you're up at Stony Brook. Is that upstate New York?
It's on Long Island. So
on Long Island. Okay. So
it never gets really cold.
Well, what's really cold to you? Because I'm going to guess mildly cold there is really cold to me.
Yeah, no, I would bet it would be. But after living, I did my postdoc at Minnesota and started out as a faculty member up in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College, which are both pretty cold places. Long Island, we get maybe a week every other winter that gets into the teens, but mostly it's around freezing and a little windy, but still a lot colder than Hattiesburg.
Yeah, that is most certain. You know what there is a lot more of on Long Island that I would love for it to be here is lacrosse. I'm a huge lacrosse guy, and I walk around with my lacrosse stick around Hattiesburg, or just from the car to the lab. I'll carry it with me. And when I was first here, my first couple years, someone would see the lacrosse stick and they'd be like, "Oh, is that for Quidditch?" And I have to just slouch my shoulders. And I can't be too upset. I actually did play Quidditch for 5 years, but that was coincidence that they landed on that. I was so sad. No one knows what lacrosse is here. And so the last thing on your note, you said in parentheses, also the Dodgers are doing well. And I bring that, as a lacrosse person, I'm not a huge baseball fan, but I'm from the Central Coast, and I'm associated with the Giants. I know we have a series coming up. I'm looking forward to the Giants having another sweep like they did the Braves.
Yeah. No, it's a good rivalry, but this year I think the Dodgers got the better of them. But.
Yeah. I'll be honest. I looked at the schedule of who the Giants played and who they play 10 minutes before we started this, just so I can be relevant to it. But that's great. So thanks for filling that out. I'm glad that you have so many things going for you to keep you happy these days. So let's talk a little bit more about you and who you are. So tell us where you're from and your upbringing a little bit.
Yeah, so I was born in Lansing, Michigan in 1972, but then we moved to California, to Pasadena in 1978. So I mostly grew up in California for school and junior high and high school. And then I stayed pretty close to Los Angeles for college at Pomona College, and then decided I really needed to escape California and ended up going to Cornell for grad school, which took a lot of adjustment. Like to go from a big warm city to a small town in upstate New York.
Yeah.
But after that, it's just been kind of moving around the country for typical academic sort of thing. The guy I was working for at Cornell moved to Berkeley, so I was there for a little while. Then, like I said before, did a postdoc at Minnesota, and then moved to Dartmouth, and then to Long Island.
So exclusively the outskirts of our country. You went to the farthest places that you can get. Yeah.
Yeah. I've missed most of the South and the Southeast, apart from short trips.
Yeah. Well, I love Hattiesburg, but I can't wait to not be in the southern weather anymore, at the very least. So talk to me a little bit about some of those stops. So what you went to Cornell for grad school. What was the focus of your work in graduate school?
So I guess when I started when I was finishing up as an undergrad, we had to write a thesis. It was just a literature thesis, but I got interested in dendrimers, and because I did a little bit of polymer work over the summer as an undergrad with Bruce Novak at Berkeley, and kind of got exposed to polymer science. But I got interested in dendrimers and went to Cornell to work for Jean Fouché, and actually ended up joining his group. And so, but then I didn't actually work on dendrimers. I ended up doing cationic polymerization, and then it was right around the time that controlled free radical polymerization was really getting big. So we started doing nitroxide mediated polymerization, and then some ATRP. And it was a few years before Raft had been really developed. Mostly using cationic and radical polymerization to make branched polymers.
And so this was all through the course of your graduate work. You started on dendrimers and started moving toward.
Well, the initial impetus for joining the group was because I was interested in dendrimers, but I never ended up. It's a big enough group, and there are enough other projects.
Right.
I ended up only watching other people run these massive columns with run the same reactions over and over again. In the end, I didn't really feel like I missed out by not making dendrimers.
That's interesting. That seems to be a common outcome for graduate students, right? You go to grad school, you have this idea of what you might be starting on, and by the end of your time there, you haven't even touched that initial idea. It's completely different.
Yeah, and I think it's the right way to do things. You don't. It's kind of like when you go to college, you don't really know. You might have an idea what you want to study or major in, but as you get exposed to other things, you end up changing your path, and it's probably usually for the best.
Right.
And it's the same as being a professor too. You come up like, oh, I'll do these projects and it'll be great, and then you figure out 3 of them don't work, and you end up doing something else completely different. So.
You have a few sad grad students, and you just got to give them something else. Yeah. I understand that. So you started moving toward controlled free radical polymerizations by the end of your graduate school work at Cornell.
Yeah, so it was around 1994, 1995 were the first papers on using tempo and other nitroxides to control polymerization from Michael Georges at Xerox, and Craig Hawker at IBM, and a couple other people.
So you finished up at Cornell, and then was it Berkeley next or Minnesota next?
Well, in my third year, I think Fouché was going to move to. Fouché moved to Berkeley, and most of the group moved with him. Mm-hmm. So I was there for probably a year and a half, finishing things up. To tie into the earlier work, I did spend a week or two on 2 separate occasions visiting Craig Hawker's lab at IBM. So got to do some nitroxide work there. And at Berkeley, I went out to visit Virgil Perchek's lab, who was at Case Western at the time, a few times to do some more ATRP-based things. But yeah, mostly at Berkeley, generally doing the same kind of mostly radical polymerization.
Sure. And so when you finished up there, did you carry on with more living polymerization techniques and studies in your postdoctoral work? Yeah,
so when I was looking at postdocs, I wanted to do something that would be something a little different. Mm-hmm. And I thought about going more biological, which a lot of people were doing at the time. But ultimately ended up going to work for Frank Bates to learn more about polymer physics of block copolymers and some living anionic polymerization, which was something I hadn't really done much of before, because it seemed kind of scary, and I still think it's kind of scary, but it was a.
You just now you perked up when it hit your brain.
Yeah.
You sat up and you said anionic. What is it about anionic polymerization? Why is that so different? What is slightly frightening?
You can do it. There are lots of different ways to do it. If you look at papers from Nikos Hydrochastides, you can see all the high vacuum apparatus that you use if you really want to do things the right way. But that also involves spending a year learning how to blow glass and
oh my gosh,
not not messing up the glass before you do the reaction. But ultimately it comes down to having to work with alkylithiums, especially for the simple block copolymer systems. A lot of them involve really low boiling monomers like isoprene and butadiene and ethylene oxide, the latter which is also really not something you want to breathe much of. And so trying to deal with these things at realistic pressures in glassware with very reactive organolithium reagents around can be a little dicey.
Sure, there's a lot of things to be aware of.
Yeah, and we were using we had a big THF still in the lab that we didn't have any problems while I was there, but a couple of years later there was a pretty big accident. Then everyone was okay, but some people spent time in the hospital with third-degree burns.
Oh my gosh!
So, yeah.
Wow, and this is from doing these anionic reactions.
Well, this is from a THF still flashing.
Oh,
which is
any idea what led to that?
My best understanding is that so the THF was being dried over potassium metal and benzophenone, so you get the nice bright purple ketyl when it's dry. But I think what was happening is that people were regenerating the still, and somehow it bumped or something happened, and some molten potassium and THF got sprayed into the air, and that just set the whole thing.
Oh my God!
Which, yeah.
Okay, that's horrifying. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so I since then I've tried never have as few stills as possible in the lab, and also tried to avoid doing anionic polymerization unless we really had to.
Right. All right. So where did you go after your postdoc?
Yeah. So after my postdoc, where I guess I should add, I started doing anionic polymerization, but then switched back into radical polymerization because it was a lot easier to make things. So it's hard to escape. So after that, it was a long season of trying to get an academic job. And this was around 2000, I guess. And it was complicated by the fact that my wife was also looking for an academic job at the same time. So we were trying to find jobs in the same general region. And it worked out that I ended up at Dartmouth College, and she was at Holy Cross, which, if you're far away, it looks kind of close, but it's a 3-hour drive, which is a rough.
It could be a lot worse. Could have been.
Yeah, it could have been worse. Though a 3-hour drive in the middle of a New Hampshire winter is not always great either. Yeah. But yeah, so we did that for a while, and then in 2009 we both were able to get jobs down here at Stony Brook and moved here.
Is your wife also in polymer science?
She has been. She did a postdoc with Mark Hillmeyer and Bill Tolman on some lactide polymerization, but she's doing more sustainability related chemistry and environmental science sorts of things now.
I don't mind me to deviate too much, but just to know more about you and your wife. Where did you meet in grad school?
Yeah, she got her PhD with Dave Collum.
Yeah, awesome.
Which is another story entirely, but
so
organolithium.
I'm going to count on you to make sure that she helps my podcast and listens to this episode. She'll enjoy this thing, right?
We'll bump up your subscriber numbers.
Yeah, exactly. It's time to pad those stats. I got to get everything rising here.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you both eventually moved down to Stony Brook. And how long ago was that? How long have you been at Stony Brook?
Started here in January of 2009.
2009. All right. So 13 years now.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah. Good night. Congrats for you. That's awesome.
Yeah. No, thinking the other day it might be the longest I've lived in one place ever in my life. So it's
a pretty good place so far. Is what it
yeah,
sounds like.
yeah.
Yeah, minus the cold. This is just going to be an extra topic of conversation throughout this podcast.
Yeah.
I think actually every time I do an interview and weather comes up, it might be apparent to our listeners now that I'm just not a fan of the cold. But back to the topic of the show, how can you talk to me about how your research has evolved since you started at Stony Brook?
So it's evolved quite a bit. When I started, I also was doing work over at Brookhaven National Lab. So we started doing some energy related research, which had a bit of a learning curve. But we started looking at doing some polymerization of conjugated monomers to make different types of polymers, which we did a little bit there with some selenophenes and tellurethines and things you wouldn't really want to look at. And we actually got back into some using epoxidized polyisoprene blocks for atomic layer deposition of metal aluminums and other alkyl metals, which was sort of entertaining. But DOE funded labs tend to drift around a lot in what they want you to do, so we haven't done as much with them in recent years. But I guess the biggest shift has been it's probably 5 years ago now or 6 years ago. I was trying to think about new things to do, and I'd reached the point where trying to do things related to sustainability, recyclability, and the obvious thing to do is to stick an acrylate group on a biomolecule and polymerize that. And I couldn't think of anything that hadn't already been done better in that angle. So started thinking about, instead of polymerizing carbon-carbon double bonds, which give you tough, hard to recycle backbones, thinking about aldehydes to make polyacetal backbones, which I can remember in grad school going back and trying to look up research from Staudinger and all these old polymer chemists and being shocked that they were looking at polymerization to formaldehyde and things that just didn't seem relevant to the chemistry we were thinking about at the time with controlled radical stuff. But going back and thinking about it and finding out that Monsanto, they'd been looking at glyoxylate esters as monomers for making detergent builders, so polyanions that would be degradable later on. And then there was some work in Japan to polymerize glyoxylic acid on its own, thought about as an analog to acrylic acid, right? Replacing the carbon-carbon double bond with a carbon-oxygen double bond. It's a classic thing where like, oh, this would be a great idea, and then you look in the literature and see that a bunch of people have already looked at it. But then it turns out that we made some efforts to try to polymerize glyoxylic acid that were completely unsuccessful. But about a year or so in, there were some really nice papers that came from Beth Gillies' group at University of Western Ontario looking at ethyl glyoxylate polymerization. And so we were able to use what they had learned and I think figure out some new things about the polymerization. But it wouldn't have been possible without her group's help. So we've struggled to purify the monomers and get things to work. And eventually my student just sent an email message to her and asked about purification, and she was really helpful and sent detailed. Yeah, it was great. I mean, it probably didn't hurt that, I guess she also got her PhD with Frichet, but probably 10 years after, not 10 years, 6 or 7 years after I was there. So
sure.
There's some
regardless, I think it's really nice to see that form of teamwork in the community, right? Being able to just reach out. That's great.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've always tried to help where I can, so it's great to see that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's bringing up the glyoxylic acid. Perfect transition, given going to your recent papers on the polymerization of ethyl glyoxylate, which you talked about. I'll read the title of a paper here. In 2021, you published amine catalyzed chain polymerization of ethyl glyoxylate from alcohol and thiol initiators.
Thrilling title.
Yeah, it is. But it was a great, entertaining paper to read, very informative. I think something good for us to focus on here. It seems to some really exciting work coming out of your group on this topic. We spoke a little bit before we started as to what is the purpose? Why do this sort of thing? Is it, we've talked about, we being myself and other guests in the past, have talked about upcycling, and that's why we focus on polyacetals a lot now in this community. But what are some of the other advantages of having a depolymerizable polymer? Right? Why focus on making these polyacetals using ethyl glyoxylate in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, my general feeling on this sort of thing is that any feasible plan for handling polymer waste is going to be way beyond what myself as a simple polymer chemist can really grasp. So it's going to take probably a lot more policy work to get things to actually be realistic. So I think what we can do as chemists is, with what I like with the polyacetals and the glyoxylates is that you've got simple monomers. So, things like ethyl glyoxylate are built up of two carbon fragments. So you could potentially make it from ethanol or sugar or other things. It's a glyoxylic acid is in a couple of different biochemical metabolic cycles. So it's around. It's probably pretty nasty on its own, and it's probably mostly present as the hydrate, but it's there. And as a polymer, it's got the potential that if you've got a closed supply stream, if you can use it, recover it completely, there's a built-in way to convert it back to the monomer. So you could chemically recycle, at least conceptually, by the acidic hydrolysis of the acetal groups. We've found out more recently, it turns out to be pretty. It's remarkably resistant to acidic hydrolysis. It might have something to do with the electron withdrawing ester groups attached, but there's at least that potential. You could also, if you hydrolyze it completely, you could get ethanol and glyoxylic acid and upcycle those into other components. But I think the most attractive thing is that it's not realistic to rely on having 100% recovery of a material. And so what polyglycolic acid will do is it's known that from a couple studies from some French groups who've done a lot of work in the area, that if you bury it in the soil, it'll decompose to carbon dioxide within 30 days, and the soil shows no apparent. If they plant seeds, they grow it the same way before and after the treatment. So it's pretty innocuous.
There been any studies to find out what that mechanism goes? How about that degradation pathway?
I imagine, it's probably, this is speculation, but I would bet that you get hydrolysis of the ethyl group side chains to the acid, and that undergoes some kind of self-catalyzed depolymerization. Once you get to glycolic acid or ethanol, it's all microbial. But
that's amazing.
I don't know for
sure. Sure. But it
just
happens.
A simple polymer chemist.
Yeah, you're just the chemist. Someone else can tell you that that's what happens. Yeah. That's fine. And so also in this paper, one of the other advantages that you mentioned for the why polymerize aldehydes in the first place is you described that their carbon to oxygen backbone is homologous to polyolefins and vinyl polymers.
Yeah.
So what are some real world applications of polyolefins and vinyl polymer? Why is it important for this polyacetal backbone to be similar to these other types of polymers?
Yeah, so this is also kind of speculative and gets into feelings that are perhaps not entirely supported by the science yet.
But we're getting a little saucy here.
Well, what better place is there for it? If you want to think about not necessarily replacing commodity polymer completely, you'd want to have degradable polymers that would be miscible and compatible and have the same sorts of properties as the existing polymers. And so, the naive thought is that, right, if you've got a polyolefin and you just replace every other carbon in the backbone with oxygen, you should get something that's got similar properties. That's not necessarily true with the really simple cases, right? If you look at polyformaldehyde or Delrin, or the polymers that you make that make up your little kick clips that go on the rotovap, right? That's pretty different from polyethylene, and they're not known to be miscible, but they are both highly crystalline and have some similarities. As you start elaborating the backbone, things start to get a little more similar, but we don't know enough to know how similar, right? So polyethyl glycosylate is homologous with polyethyl acrylate, which is it's not used as much as other types of acrylates, but at least gets us a start to thinking about similarities.
So it kind of comes down to if there's potential to apply them in things in the real world, it has to be compatible with items that exist, materials that exist already.
Yeah, I think that's, you could design things completely new, but I think there the barrier to getting large scale adoption would be so huge that it'd have to be a really special material to get people to do that.
Sure. Okay.
And so trying to build things up slowly is probably the best we can do right now.
Sure. And if you do it that way, you're probably beating your head against the wall a little bit less than trying to reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah, but you look at some of have you seen any of the work from Brett Helms's group? So they're looking at some new types of, I guess they're Vitromer-like materials. They're almost entirely new types of backbones, but they're really cool and they're worth looking at as another option. But again, trying to get that into a state where you could make a commercial material out of it is it's another level to get to.
Yeah.
Which
right, being able to control the architecture, the molecular weights, and all that. Actually, this is a nice transition. In one of the comments in this paper we just mentioned, if you'd like, I could reread the title, but there was a comment on being able to fabricate these polyethyl glyoxylate polymers at higher molecular weights that traditionally people were getting, less than 2,000 grams per mole. Why is it beneficial to be able to have higher molecular weights under controlled polymerizations?
Well, it's nice to be able to know you can do it. It's not always clear that you need it once you get up to really high molecular weights. I think, for a lot of the materials applications, it's, if you can get if you need a high molecular weight, then the dispersity and the control over the structure might not matter as much. So, polyethylene and polypropylene, these things probably at high molecular weights, probably have pretty broad dispersities, but are still entirely useful and probably easier to make. But when you have at lower intermediate molecular weights, where you have applications where you want to control composition or you want to make something that's got the right degree of hydrophilicity and hydrophobicity, there it's important to be able to control, if not the dispersity or the distribution of molecular weights, at least being able to make sure that every chain you start has a reactive group at the end that can attach to something else. They usually go together, but it's...
You mentioned just now being able to control the structure and architecture too. Can you comment on that? What are the importances of being able to have a controlled, complex structure? And actually, a follow-up: what would you consider are complex polymer structures?
Yeah, well, it's one of these eye of the beholder sorts of things. I guess the pragmatic explanation is that what you need depends on the application that you're going to use it for. For me, my people I work with usually, we're interested in what we can do with the chemistry and how far we can push systems to control the structure. And so complexity, we're not trying that hard to get to really lots of different blocks or controlled degrees of branching, but at least trying to get good control over making enough, 1 or 2 blocks, good control over how many chain ends have a specific functional group is good enough. We tried a little bit to try to control the stereochemistry of the linkages, but it's been tricky so far.
Gotcha. With the polyethyl glyoxylate, man, it's a tongue twister trying to skip that one out a bunch of times. But with making these specific polymers, have you found that the physical properties are close to, say, these polyolefins and other vinyl polymers?
So we've almost entirely looked at just polyethyl glyoxylate right now. We're trying to get to some other esters and some other systems, but they're close. One of the things we've been trying to look at, which get to a fundamental polymer science question, is if you make a diblock copolymer of polyethyl glycolate and polyethyl acrylate, the two blocks only differ in the backbones. Right? Will the two blocks mix with each other, or will they stay phase separated? Because the dogma is that if there's any little difference in chemistry between two blocks, they're probably not going to mix with each other, unless there's some good enthalpic reason for them to mix, right? So deuterated polyethylene and regular polyethylene apparently don't mix at reasonable molecular weights, which is always surprises me. So we're trying to see with these two if they'll mix or not, and we're getting, it looks like by DSC that they show a single glass transition temperature at relatively low molecular weights, but we're trying to do some X-ray scattering and some microscopy and other things to really probe it and see. See what's happening.
What topic? What is something within polymer science that not in your lab, but is something that really is grasping your attention right now? Is there anything happening in the polymer science community that whenever you see it in a paper on a cover, when you read about it, it seems so incredibly interesting to you?
There's a lot. It's sort of boring, but
not to you.
What I'm most interested in right now is seeing how different types of specific catalysis are getting used to make new types of polymers, and make polymers from things that you wouldn't normally consider monomers, which is a lot of it's coming from the organic literature, but I think there's potential for making some exciting new things there. We've been trying to, with the aldehyde polymerization, the not so secret of aldehydes is that they're a pain in the ass to work with. They react with water, they do all sorts of side reactions, so you got to really purify them well before you do them. So we've been trying to get to ways to use ketones as monomers, so to make polyketals and methacrylate analogs and things. But those, you have the acidic alpha protons on the ketone, so they do all sorts of, with base catalyzed stuff, they do more ketoenol things than coupling. So we've been trying to look at some of the photoelectrochemistry and related sorts of things that people like Tristan Lambert at Cornell have used to do CH activation and do dehydrogenative coupling. So what we really want to do, and I don't know if it's ever going to happen, is to think about ways to take alcohols and do a dehydrogenative coupling to make an acetal linkage. So then you could do make ketals or make thioaldehyde or thioketone derivatives or other things.
So really opening up new methods for types of synthesis, polymer synthesis.
Expanding the types of monomers that you can use to make polymers, which I think has the potential to let you get into all sorts of other renewable feedstocks.
Yeah. Tell us why it's important to have a larger library from which to choose a monomer to make your polymer.
Well, I mean, again, to not, just to sort of stay agnostic about where things come from. If there are good reasons to not rely on petroleum as a feedstock, and in the future it might become necessary to look to other feedstocks. So being able to derive materials that aren't just the stuff that we use because it's easy to make it from petroleum, I think is going to be beneficial, right? Because we're ethylene, propylene, styrene are all pretty cheap, but that's because you can crack you crack petroleum and get the precursors.
Right.
But if we want to move on to other things, and I don't think it's obvious that what the best feedstock is going to be if we wanted to replace petroleum. I think there are lots of options, but having ways to polymerize monomers that aren't necessarily olefins or even aldehydes is or esters or all sorts of things might help in the future.
Sure. I mean, when it comes to needing sustainable material production, having options is going to be incredibly beneficial. Yeah.
I think, that's the luxury of being an academic too, is that you can, an academic with tenure, I guess, is you can think for the, you're doing stuff in the literature that people might look at 50 years from now. They might, they might not ever again, but that's okay too.
Yeah.
You think about some of the papers I dig up trying to find things are totally unrelated to polymer chemistry at the time, but they still have value and are of interest. And I'm glad somebody else did them 50 years ago, so we don't have to do them now. Right?
Well, ideally, many people will be glad you've done the work actually, many people are already glad that you've done the work you've done. So thank you for this. Thank you for that. And thank you again for being on the show. Before I close this out, is there any final comments that you'd like to add regarding our discussion today? Or maybe you have advice for grad students? Anything you want to add?
Oh, wow. Well, first, let me thank you. It was fun to...
My pleasure.
Fun to chat.
Yeah.
I think this is the first... No, I was on a podcast a long time ago. But this is the second one.
All right. Well, we're bringing you back into the game.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I can't think of anything wise enough to...
That's no problem.
to pollute the airwaves. But yeah. If anyone wants to get in touch, feel free to give them my contact info.
All right. Dr. Grubbs, thank you so much for being on the show. And thank you to my guests listening now. This is the Polymer Science Podcast. My name is Jacob Scheckman, and if you have any questions, any comments, or maybe you want to be on the show, feel free to reach out to us at PolymerSciencePodcast@gmail.com. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you later.